what are some opportunities you think that an entrepreneur listening,
Let's break down the supply chain and think about this from every different step.
are people open to change here? Or is it easy for someone to build and then go to distillers?
If you're a big player, difficult to change.
I don't know how you're drinking.
This 20-year-old, 25-year-old who's never had a whiskey before.
I don't appreciate that. I'm not a big wine person.
If you went to an Indian wedding maybe 10 years ago, I would say everyone's drinking Johnny Walker.
Why don't you talk about as you're raising the fund?
Let's break down.
Hey guys, welcome back to Funds and Founders. We have Rakesh on today, and I reached out on LinkedIn. We sort of connected. I find what you're doing super interesting. You've been in the liquor industry and whiskey industry for quite a while. But why don't you just quickly tell folks what you're working on, what you're building? I have this joke where I have everyone plug themselves in the beginning because retention on YouTube is like 2 minutes. And so
Yep.
we plug you now, plug you at the end. But just very quickly, why don't you cover what you're working on and what your background is?
Yeah, so I work in the Scotch whiskey industry, which is a very fun industry to be part of. I've been part of it for 10 years. I'm working on a few different companies, one in the Scotch industry. So one is helping people that want to invest in whiskey as an alternative asset class. We can talk more about that. Two,
Yeah.
a new company, a new project we're focused on actually helping people to celebrate milestones in their life through private bottlings and interesting, cool experiences with whiskey. And the third project, actually looking, and this is very early stages, but looking at the effects or rather the advantages of blockchain, tokenization,
Nice.
that whole world, and how we could apply that to whiskey today, which is a 600-year-old industry. And sometimes it acts like it, to be honest, in terms of how archaic things are. So I think there's a lot of opportunity really for
Nice.
disruption and doing new fun things.
I wanted to jump in and sort of get your take on where does the opportunity lie in this space? What's something that people underestimate about this space? And maybe if you can just break down the industry real quick on like roughly how big the industry is, what the market size is for anyone listening who potentially wants to build for this space. And then let's go into potential opportunities that you see for people to build something in this space.
Yeah, so look, the Scotch whiskey industry is a US $6 billion industry. So it's that's the number of
And that's
that's the value.
worldwide, right?
Yeah, that's the value
Yeah.
of total exports of Scotch whiskey, last year roughly. So it's massive, right? And we're just talking about Scotch whiskey. Of course, there's bourbon, there's
Yeah.
whiskeys made all over the world, and there's all kinds of variations. But I'm just talking about the
Yeah.
specifically Scotch whiskey industry, right? So it's a very very large industry. Whiskey was most people claim or so they say was founded in Scotland, right? So this is the origins of whiskey. And I think in terms of opportunities, what's important to understand, right? Why I got into whiskey 10 years ago, and I researched a lot, and I used to be in the wine industry before this, right? So I was researching kind of Scotch and rum and tequila, vodka, all kinds of different areas. And what's unique about Scotch whiskey, and the most important thing to understand, right, is to make a 18-year-old Scotch, right, like a Highland Park or a Macallan or Lefroy, takes 18 years, right? You can't make that happen any faster, right? If
Yeah.
everyone in the world tomorrow started drinking vodka, they would just ramp up making more vodka because it doesn't take that long to make vodka, and you just make as much as you need it. But the whole thing around Scotch whiskey is they have to predict, right, or forecast 18 years in advance, 25 years in advance, 30 years in advance what the demand is going to be, because to make that whiskey, let's say an 18-year-old Macallan, takes 18 years of aging in the wood, in the cask, right? Once the whiskey is in the bottle, all aging stops, right? So that makes this a very, very unique asset class, because I can tell you most of the time that forecasting is wrong, very simply, right? So back
Yeah.
in the 80s and 1990s, right, they didn't put enough whiskey down into single casks
Barrels.
meet the demand that we have in the world today. So there's no shortage of, and just to be clear, there's no shortage of blended whiskey like Johnny Walker or Chivas, like those kind of brands. That's a blended whiskey. You can blend to make that flavor, right? So that there's no shortage of that. The shortage is of aged single malt whiskey, which predominantly comes from Scotland, right? And that's what we're focused on, and that's the industry that I've fallen in love with for the last decade.
Nice. And if we wanted to double click into sort of opportunities, right? So you briefly mentioned some ideas. Just off the riffing off the top of my head, something that comes to mind is there a world where you can build sort of a SaaS forecasting tool for distillers and sort of help them understand their demand, their market segment, what the pull for their whiskey is, and sort of forecast that? I don't know if there's a need or if someone would pay, but just riffing on that idea, what are some opportunities you think that an entrepreneur listening could potentially build or try to understand in this space?
I think there's so much opportunity, right? Especially with the pace of development of AI, right? I think this industry is really ripe, to be honest, for disruption and for new
Yeah,
technology. So let's break down the supply chain and think about this from every different step, right? So from a
yeah,
distillation point of view, there's definitely opportunities for better forecasting, right? And just better information, data, et cetera, managing large amounts of data, big data to do a better job at distillation, right? And I'm sure there's lots of things there. Second one is the warehousing, right? So once the whiskey is made, it's put into casks, right? So
yeah,
you're talking, Diageo, for example, which is obviously one of the largest companies, has millions of casks, right? Across warehouses in Scotland. I don't know exactly what their inventory management system is. I know it's huge,
but
but
yeah,
certainly you could be applying all kinds of new AI models to look at
yeah,
evaporation of casks in different environments, different places within the warehouse, different temperatures, all that kind of stuff, right? So that's warehousing. Then you're getting into efficiencies and new technologies around clean energy, et cetera, for during the bottling process, right? And how can you create new packaging materials that are more environmentally friendly, more recyclable? Lots of opportunities there. And then lastly, I think you talk about the customer experience. That's probably where there's the most opportunity, right? So how are customers engaging with brands today? How are customers learning about whiskeys, right? But when you traditionally think of whiskey, and I think this is pretty clear even in movies, TV, etc., right? It's predominantly thought of as a guy. It's usually a male in their 40s or 50s, sipping a whiskey, right? It's in James Bond
yeah.
movies. It's Mad Men, right? That's those are the images that come up for people when they think about high end single malt whiskey. But that world is changing, right? We've got a whole new generation of customers across the world, particularly, I would say, in China and India and other places, but really globally, Middle East, etc., who are experiencing whiskey in a completely new way. So, how do you engage this new customer, right? This 20-year-old, 25-year-old who's never had a whiskey before, and or maybe he's not going to drink it in the traditional way at a bar,
Yeah.
with their dad or something like that, right? Like there's different ways to engage these new customers. So I think there's a lot of opportunities across the supply chain. Really applying technology and really looking at how the consumer is changing, right? And I think that's happening across all luxury asset classes.
So I think one thing I'd love to get your take on is what do you think the appetite is for this industry to adapt new tech, right? So like an analogy I'll give you is I've done a bunch of stuff in the vet and pet space in the US, and
Yeah.
my understanding is that the people in that space are hesitant to adapt new tech, and sort of now the adoption curve becomes harder and more work, right? So even if you build the latest and greatest, it's really hard to go and get people in that space to be like, oh, let me go use this because it's beneficial. Because they have something that works, they just want to stick to it,
Yeah.
right? And so maybe something if you could break down is are people open to change here? Is it easy for someone to build and then go to distillers and people in the space and exporters and importers and be like, hey, use my software. Don't use what you've been using for 20 years.
I mean, look, I think it's a good question, but I think I think it's the same in every industry. I don't know. You tell me from some of the other interviews you've done if this is true, but I would say, exactly to your point, the larger players in any space are kind of stuck in what they've already been doing,
100%.
and it's
Yeah, yeah.
harder for them to adapt, right? And I think that's the same in the whiskey industry. If you're a big player, difficult to change. But if you're, a medium sized or smaller player, then you're looking for that edge, right? And that's where you got to start. And I think those are the types of people that want to do something different, right? I'll give you a good example, right? So we built our own warehouse, cask warehouse from
Yeah.
scratch 3 years ago, right? So in Scotland, near a city called Aberdeen in Scotland, we have our own warehouse for about 2,200 casks, right? And the reason we built our own warehouse was we felt that in the industry at that time, and it has evolved a little bit, but in the industry at that time, about 3+ years ago, there wasn't a lot of cask warehouses that were built for private client storage. So warehouses were built for what distilleries store, and what distilleries store is a lot of what we call new make whiskey, which means whiskey that just came out of the distillery, and younger
Yeah.
whiskeys for long term aging, right? So when you do that, you don't need access to the whiskey if you're putting it in storage for maybe the next 10 years, right? But for our type of company that focuses on private clients, right? We want our clients to have access to the whiskey, to be able to go visit their whiskey, to be able to draw a sample whenever they want, to be able to even do a
Makes
partial
sense.
bottling, right? So we built our own warehouse with with that in mind, and designed it in a way that customers can do exactly that: visit the warehouse, get a sample, all the things, do a bottling, all that kind of stuff, right? And when we were out there looking at warehouse, information management systems or inventory systems, there's one software that everybody uses, and it's so complicated and has so much information that
What's
it's
it called?
great. Yeah, that one's called Drams, right? And it's a
Okay.
fantastic software if you are managing a distillery, which we weren't, right? And we're not, right? So that's a
100%.
great one for the masses, right, and the big players. But there's a newer company called Vapor, which hasn't been around as long, but they're a lot more customized, a lot more, willing to adapt to the needs that we had. We worked with them at, I think, relatively fraction of the cost in order to customize the needs that we had, right? And I think the Vapor, I would definitely recommend to anybody who obviously needs that kind of cask inventory system. So I guess coming, full circle back to your question, right? Like I think this is the same in every industry. It's harder to get the bigger guys to change. The adoption rate, as you say, will always be slower, but there's always opportunity for
Makes sense.
small, medium size. Is that what you see with other industries as
So
well?
my take is that if you go to very traditional industry like healthcare, vet care, pet care, we were talking yesterday. I was telling you about talking to the OnlyFans marketer.
Yeah,
The audience in this space, because they're a little less technical than normal, they're a little harder to convince to use new software because
yeah,
now you're talking about changing a whole workflow, which comes
yeah,
with a lot of education and training. And so the output has to be good enough to warrant that change.
yeah,
Versus if I go to tech or I'm building tech for consumers, as long as I'm solving the right problem, it's relatively easy to convince a consumer to switch over to your platform because you just do their problem a little better, a little faster, or a little more in tune to what they like, right? So
yeah.
from that
Yeah.
analogy, yes, I feel like there's industries where it definitely is harder to warrant the change, but then in some spaces it's relatively easy to convince someone to because it's a no-brainer, right? So I think
Yeah.
that
Yeah, and
is
look, and
always
I
a pick
think
and
in
choose.
this
Yeah.
space, right? Yeah, and I think in the whiskey space, and I think we're seeing it, right? I mean, there are new brands for whiskey being developed, on a weekly basis, right? So
Yeah.
obviously, I focus on Scotch whiskey, but I think what's cool and interesting about the industry broadly is you're seeing new distilleries and new brands popping up in India, in Australia,
Yeah.
in Thailand, in China, in the U.S., obviously, there's already hundreds of different brands as well as distilleries, right? And those two are always not always the same thing. I think that's important to understand, right? You could have a bourbon whiskey brand that's buying their whiskey from another distillery and then just packaging it themselves and selling it under their brand, but it doesn't mean that
Yeah.
they actually made the whiskey, right? So there's a lot of opportunities, I think, with creating new brands that fit a customer niche, right? You're looking for a customer segment that's underserved, or you're looking for a certain price point or a certain quality, or you're looking for some regional aspect, right? You're trying to get people, bourbon, obviously, mostly, right, originally used to come from Kentucky, but now you have distilleries all over the country in Michigan and Texas and Washington and Oregon. So this is, a newer, relatively fad where people are looking for more localized, closer to the source, types of experiences and brands that they can connect with, right?
Makes sense. Just random sidebar. I was getting this thought of my head, like if you had to rank all the liquor types from your order of like best to like I don't like, what's your order of
Are we going?
various
Are
liquors?
we doing it all in one night, or what are we talking about here?
Just in order of preference. So like if
Yeah,
you had to pick and choose, like what's your order of preference top down?
I mean, look, for me personally, I've always been a wine guy. So for me, and because especially with food, like if I'm having a good steak, I gotta have a nice glass of red wine, right? So
Nice.
so for me, I think wine's still number one. Whiskey, obviously, a close second. So before dinner dram, or I think for me, after dinner, it's kind of a perfect time to have a dram. I really is weather dependent, right? When it's like hot and sticky and muggy, a whiskey is not really something I'm going for.
Yeah.
In that case, just like a cold beer, right? So I
Nice.
think that those would be my go tos.
Nice.
Way down on the list would be for me. Tequila. I know people love tequila, but I had way too many shots of bad quality tequila
Yeah.
in college and after college, so that's kind of ruined me. I have
Yeah.
tasted tequila. I appreciate all the people listening who love tequila. I get you. There is great tequila. I just can't do it myself personally. It's not something that
I feel like stereotypically tequila is like you want to party, get drunk, and sort of very high energy vibe. Like when you say tequila, that's the first thing that comes to mind
But
versus
now people are into like super high end sipping tequila, right? It's
like
like a whole
mezcals and stuff.
yeah. Now people are into mezcals and all kinds of stuff. So it's gone kind of a whole different vibe. I think tequila has,
Yeah.
and it's definitely much more than Jose Cuervo, which it was 20 years ago
Yeah.
when I was in my 20s in New York. Like that was tequila. That was pretty much it. So I think unfortunately for me, I got into tequila at the wrong time. So for me, it's kind of more down on the list. But yeah, look, obviously, wine and single malt whiskey, are where I are where my passions lie, and that's the industries I've been involved in for the last 15
Nice.
years.
Going back to building an idea in this space, if you could double click on what's the right way to go to market and approach this so hypothetically I'm an entrepreneur, I've built some tech solution for people in the scotch and whiskey space. What
Yeah,
is the best way for me to approach them, go to market, get sort of users, get people onboarded, sort of sell my product? The analogy I'll give you is I was talking to this OnlyFans marketer yesterday, and her recommendation was if you want to build for that space, don't go to creators directly, go to people running agencies, PRs, publicists, because you're going to need to incentivize them for them to be able to build trust with your creators because your creators are never going to respond to you.
right.
So how should people approach that in this space? What's an ideal go-to-market channel to just get in front of these users, talk to these users, potentially get them to build and buy your software.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on what kind of business you're talking about, right? So if it's more of a software kind of business and you're trying to sell it to the brands themselves, right? Then it's really about I kind of came back to before. Where in the supply chain are you really adding
Makes
value?
sense.
And then you need to go to obviously like the right trade shows. I mean, the good thing about whiskey, one of the good things is it's a very social industry, right? Where right, so
Yeah,
people get together, they do, very large whiskey conferences, festivals, tasting events. Like this stuff is happening all over the world, pretty much, year round. Right? There's a huge event called, I think, Whiskey Live, right? And they run Whiskey Live in many cities around the world, all year round. So you can go to these things and meet distributors, meet merchants, meet customers, and the trade shows. So that's really where I would start. If I was trying to figure out how to get in there. But I think beyond that, right, the whiskey world is exactly that. It's a huge global space. So you have to figure out what's your niche and what's your
makes sense.
value here, right? So I think what's interesting, for example, right, if you look at the world, right, and this from a Scotch exports point of view, the U.S. is the largest market, right? But beyond that is where it gets interesting. You got France at number two, Singapore at number three, or Taiwan usually at number three, four. They switch back and forth. Taiwan is a relatively small country.
Yeah,
For Taiwan to be in the top four of all Scotch whiskey exports globally, right? Let's remember that China and India are further down on that list, right? We're
yeah,
comparing populations of billions versus tens of millions. So there are these niche countries and opportunities that I think people overlook. Everyone goes for the big fish, right? Okay, let's crack the United States, or let's stay local to the UK. For example, for us, we're more interested in some of these, let's say, more niche markets like Taiwan, or even more interestingly, obviously, if you can crack it, would be a market like India. And then, I think not far away are markets like the Middle East, right? Dubai, UAE. Just made alcohol legal, whatever it was, X years ago. Saudi Arabia now on that track, which is pretty
Oh, I
surprising.
didn't know this. Okay, yeah, yeah.
Saudi's on that track, not yet, but on that track. And UAE just made, I think it was earlier this year, reduced all import duty on alcohol. So that's a big move. So clearly making, if you want tourism, right, in the Middle East, and you want to grow your economy, you got to serve booze, right? And so
Yeah,
if
yeah, yeah.
you move towards opening up the economy, making things a little bit easier. I mean, it was only maybe 10, 15 years ago you went to Dubai, you had to have a license to purchase alcohol if it wasn't at a hotel, or 5-star hotel, etc. If you were a local there, all of that has changed, right? Things are evolving rapidly. I think in India is a great example, right?
Yeah.
So we're both Indian, and you go to an Indian wedding, you're talking 200 people, 300 people, 500 people, 1,000 people. If you went to an Indian wedding maybe 10 years ago, I would say everyone's drinking Johnny Walker Black, right? Or
Yeah,
Shiraz, right? That's kind of the go-to, right? You go to an Indian wedding today, I would say even though there's a huge open bar, most people are going for single malt whiskey. They're going for the Talisker,
yeah,
they're going for the Khaled, they're going for the Glenlivet. So that's a massive change in a
hundred
relatively
percent.
short amount of time that people have evolved from, drinking blended Johnny Walker, which is a great whiskey, but obviously at a lower price point, to now higher end single malt brands. If that trend continues, which I think it will, we're just at kind of the tip of the iceberg there. There's a lot of opportunity in growth markets, right?
100%. And I think just clicking into India for a second, there's so many markets within the market where you can now start innovating on price and like what your offering is and the size of the offering. Because there's this concept of like India one, two, three, where you have the premium, you have the people who afford like the 1,200 rupees to like 2,000, and then you have the lesser than 500. And so I've seen a lot of like brands pitch on like random Shark Tank like shows
Yeah.
where they'll be like, hey, the lesser than $500 a bottle is, catered to. Above 1,500 is catered to. We're in the 800-900, which is, like premium-ish, makes you feel
Right.
like you're getting something better, but you can't afford the 2K rupee a bottle. And so like there's so many dynamics within that market that you can sort of cater to, that
Yeah.
it's like there's so much room to grow there.
Well, yeah, and I think to your point, right? Like whiskey is generally seen, right, as something that affluent people drink. I'm talking about single malt
Yeah.
whiskey, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
not
yeah.
everyone's drink, right? And so to be seen drinking, higher end single malt whiskey is something that people aspire to, right? So it's kind of
100%. 100%.
up there as part of that evolution of growing up. You start buying slightly better things, experiencing slightly better
Yeah.
things, drinking slightly better things, driving slightly better, cars. So part of that whole move up that luxury chain, whiskey's a part of that. And so I think like if you can figure out, to your point, where are you in that value chain? Again, are you at the lower end of that? Are you at the higher
Yeah.
end of that? Are you in the middle of that? And are you getting people at the right point? But look, I think coming back though, I think there's another big area we haven't talked about, which is whiskey education, right? So, there's a lot of people in the world who enjoy their whiskey, love their whiskey, want to continue, their path of enjoying whiskey.
Yeah.
But there's a much bigger population who really don't drink whiskey or maybe have the wrong impressions of whiskey. I'm always surprised by the number of people that I meet, who think, oh, whiskey, it's too harsh, or it burns, or things like that. And I find a lot of
Yeah.
times
Yeah.
when I talk to them for about 5, 6 minutes, I realize, well, they're actually not drinking whiskey right, or they've never really been taught how to drink whiskey properly or how to enjoy it properly in a way that they can really get into the flavors, right? One of the unique things about whiskey, right, compared to, let's say, I don't know, vodka or gin or things like that, right? There's variations of gin, there's variations of vodka, but I would argue in the whiskey world, there's a much broader range of variety of styles, right? You've got all kinds of peated, smoky style whiskeys, all the way to sherry dominated, strong, fruit flavored whiskeys, and everything kind of in between, right? So some people try a whiskey and think, oh, I don't like whiskey, but maybe you just don't like that whiskey. And how do
100%.
you get
Yeah.
people, you know, I think whiskey education is a huge opportunity, that anybody could set up a company doing anywhere, especially now, again, with technology, and you could be sending people tasting kits around the world. And
Yeah.
it doesn't have education. Traditionally was done around a table, 10 people, you're all going through it together. Now, right, in our world, there's so many better ways to learn, about something new, right? And not just chat GPT or AI, but experiential ways that groups can learn and progress, what they want to know
100%.
about history, right?
100%. Just not that you asked, but I hate Lefroy. I don't know how people like it. For me, it's too strong.
You're not a PD guy then.
No, no, yeah. I mean, maybe I've just not had the right one, but a friend was like, "Hey, why don't you try this?" And I was like, "I don't know how you're drinking." Like it just like I
And,
couldn't. And like
yeah,
that's
and
the
yet
only one
some
where I've been
people
like,
love
I
it, right?
cannot have this. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I get you. And I used to be there. So I think, it's interesting because I think also tastes change over time, right? So
yeah,
when I
yeah,
started my whiskey journey about 10 years ago, I was a very heavy sherry whiskey fan, right? So I was into the Macallans and the Glendronachs and like very like heavy sherry style whiskey. Traditionally, some people start there, right? But then over time, you start kind of your taste evolve, things change. I kind of became started getting into lighter peaty style whiskey. So like a Talisker, for example, I think is a great one.
yeah.
Bowmore is a great mix of a bit of sherry and a bit of peat. So for me, also, I actually agree. Look, if somebody gave me a Lefroy, I would try it, but it's not what I would choose if I was, had a list to choose from. Having said that, I've had some amazing Lefroys, along the way, right? So I think the beauty of people who are on this whiskey journey is you're never done learning, you're never done tasting, and it's kind of part of the fun is to keep trying new things and really
100%.
evolve your palate, right? So how could you build a business around that and around educating people in the world. And again, I'm only talking about Scotch whiskey. You start expanding this to Japanese whiskeys, Indian whiskeys, bourbons, right? You could go on and on and on for all the types of education there is around this.
Yeah. I met a guy in Austin who goes to Napa once a year.
Yeah,
And I was like, so what do you do every time? He's like, we're going to different wineries and like he's like, I'm taking notes frantically of like, hey, what's the wine I'm drinking? What does
right.
it pair with? What does it not pair with?
Yeah,
And I was like, oh, there's so much more to like wine drinking than there is. And he's like, yeah. And I was like, what's been the biggest learning? And I think the example he gave me was one day they were having fish at like a pesto fish something at home,
okay.
and the wine didn't pair. And then he's like, oh, he remembered like some notes of like how to pair wines with stuff. And
Yeah,
then he's like, oh, because we're having this kind of fish, let me go pull out that bottle. And then it
and it
just
worked.
no, I don't appreciate that. I'm not a big wine person either way. But just to your point of like over 25 years of just going every year to Napa, he's
Yeah,
now built up this understanding of how to drink, how to pair, how to choose, what's the different kinds within Napa.
yeah,
Austin and like Fredericksburg area also has a bunch of wineries. And so he's like, there's this one winery where you can grow the same kind of grapes as this one region in Napa. And so like they try to go there and try out their wines because the similar flavor,
yeah. It's
whatever.
similar to what
But
they like.
like
But it's about the experience, right? I mean, I
100%,
I used to
100%.
I lived in New York for 10 years, and my love for all of this actually started in kind of Napa and Sonoma. We used to go once a year, and I would argue that the wine always tastes better, whatever or the whiskey or whatever it is you're tasting, when you're on that experience. Like I
Yeah.
remember we would go on these trips and I would order cases of wine and then have the wine when I got back to New York. And it never tasted as good as
Yeah,
when you were
yeah.
on the trip, right? Because when you're on the trip, it's sunny, you're with your friends, you're on holiday, like all of these things kind of combine, right? But I would say, it is all about the experience. And I think that's the other part that people want now. So, I started, I think, as you know, like the world's first private equity fund 10 years ago to invest in whiskey as an asset class. And one of the key things we did when I started the fund is we did an annual trip for obviously optional annual trip for any investor who wanted to go to Scotland for 5 days every year and experience different parts of the industry. And we would visit some distilleries and do some tastings, but also we went to a cooperage, which is where they build the casks, right? So how
Yeah.
does the cask itself actually form? Or we would go visit independent bottling brands, or get a representative from Diageo to come talk about how things are going in the industry from their perspective. So I think people really appreciated those kinds of experiences. I think anywhere where you can get some insight that you can't get just kind of reading, on the internet or watching videos. And then obviously that in-person experience of doing something that not everyone gets to do. It could be, for example, going into the back of a warehouse at a distillery and trying something really special just because the distillery manager on that day, happens to be a friend of mine, is kind of letting you do something like that. Or we went to Isla, right, which is where Lafroig is, and Bowmore, and cracking fresh oysters that just came right out of the bay there in front of Bowmore, right, and you have that sea air, and like these are the kinds of things, or trips to Napa, whatever it is. I think that's what the new consumer is looking for as well, right? It's not just a, hey, sell me a product and I'll drink it at home or at a bar. It's how can I connect with the brand? How do I experience a brand? How do I, get these unique experiences that are worth maybe a little bit more to me than, just
100%.
collecting, things on a shelf, right? So I think the experience side of things is very important in any consumer facing product today, especially if you're in the luxury industry like I am, right?
100%. And I was just thinking when you were saying that, I was like, what is the Napa for like Scotch whiskey? I can't think of one. Like I can't like when you say Napa, like people understand what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's
There
parallel
is,
for this
yeah. Well,
space.
so it's Speyside, right? So Speyside in Scotland, with Speyside, it means literally by the River Spey, right? So it's about 3-ish, 4 hours north of Edinburgh, right? So you fly into Edinburgh and you kind of drive or take a train up. Or you can fly kind of, I think, into parts of Speyside now, but that's where most of the distilleries are. They're all kind of centered around. So all the Glens, right? Glenlivet, Glenturret, Glenfiddich, most things starting with Glen are all there. That's where Macallan is, right? That's where like the
Got
biggest
it.
are, and there's where you're getting kind of the home of, generally speaking, this sherry style whiskey that people love around the world. So I think today maybe about 60 distilleries out of a total of, I think there's about 130 right now in Scotland. I think about 60 of them, so close to half are in the Speyside area. So when
Got it.
people
Okay.
say, I want to go, to kind of the home of whiskey in Scotland, that's what they're talking about.
Got
Um,
it.
and it's an amazing place. I've been lucky enough being part of this industry for 10 years to have visited, I think, close to 40 distilleries, and every distillery is
Nice.
unique, and tells its own story. To be honest, after about 5 or 6 distilleries, you don't really need to be taught the whiskey making process anymore.
Yeah.
Generally, speaking. But each distillery has its own character, and if you plan it correctly, which is also something we do as well. So we also have a business that focuses on luxury travel trips to Scotland
Nice.
to help people who want to play golf. Obviously, it's the home of golf. Visit some distilleries, understand a bit more about whiskey. Come visit our warehouse, right, which I mentioned earlier, and taste some cask samples. So we also kind of went into that vertical of luxury travel and experiences, which is
Nice.
proving very popular. I think people, as we were saying, always looking for something different, right? And from London, we're talking about an hour and a half flight up from London. So a lot of people, go to London or Europe for a vacation. Haven't really thought about Scotland, but as somebody who now resides in Scotland most summers, so I'm there kind of most Julys. I can tell you it's a gorgeous place.
Nice.
And the weather is only getting better with global warming. So that's the positive side, if there is one, to global warming, is that
Yeah.
these places that were way too cold for way too long are actually getting mildly pretty good during the summer now.
I like that. The reason I was asking was this feels like something you got to know about if you're interested, right? So, like, a lot of people know about Napa Valley, even if they're not into wine. But
Yeah,
sort of the parallel I'm trying to make is that this exists, but you got to be super interested to know that it
yeah,
exists and that it's a thing, right? Like, this is the first time I've heard
yeah. Well, we got
um,
to get you out there. Clearly,
about the, yeah.
we'll
And
we'll
so,
get you out
yeah. And I think it's one of those things, right? It's like, are you interested enough to like dive deeper into the specifics and the mechanics and the industry and how it works and the social aspect of it? But yes, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and we'll chat about something after as well that just
But yeah, look, I think, I
came to
think,
mind
yeah,
of
I think
yeah.
there's obviously a lot of people who drink whiskey, right? But I think to your point, maybe people are not thinking about, how could I collect whiskey, or how
Yeah,
might I
yeah,
invest in whiskey, or how might I build a business around, this industry, or how could I get involved to learn more about this industry, right? And I agree with you. I think that's where the opportunity is, and that's where I focus, and sort of our group of companies focus is trying to get out there and get more and more people engaged, right? So all of our businesses are direct to consumer businesses, right? So we have I'm part of a business called Whiskey Hammer, which is an online auction business, right? We have Still Spirit, which is our e-commerce business. So each of these businesses in different ways. We have the warehousing, we sell cask, travel. All of these are trying to meet different needs that people have in the whiskey space, right? And that's kind of the vision for what I set out to do after I did the private equity whiskey fund, is to build this group of companies that's really on a mission to do exactly what you're talking about, which is to educate and empower and allow people to have these memorable experiences, and sometimes once in a lifetime type experiences that they can share with their family and friends,
Love that.
which is the
Wanted
fun of
to
it.
switch wanted to switch gears just a little bit and talk about sort of your journey, right? So, how does someone who's in the wine space start a whiskey business? How does that work? What do the early days look like there?
Yeah, so I can take you back to 2013. It was kind of the towards the end of 2013. I was running a wine business, a wine distribution business in Hong Kong. I've been running it for a few years. It had done well and then was not doing as well. It was very competitive in that space at that time. Margins started getting lower. It just became harder and harder to really see a long term future in the wine business in Hong Kong for what I was doing. Obviously, lots of opportunity in wine, but for the little part that I was doing, I didn't see a long term future. So I started exploring different opportunities and, researched vodka, researched rum, researched whiskey. And what I found in the whiskey industry was, and this is, I think, true today as it was, 11 years ago, 12, almost 12 years ago now. There is this imbalance between supply of old and rare single malt whiskey, which is limited, right, and reducing because again, whiskey is a consumable. So if you have a super old rare whiskey, there's less of it now, versus growing demand, right? So when I saw that imbalance between supply and demand, it was something I got intrigued by, and really, I mean, being completely honest, I just spent an entire weekend on Google researching statistics about whiskey. It sounds pretty boring, but just deep diving into, whiskey production and demand and just understand, now I could probably put that into a nice prompt and it would
Yeah,
be
yeah.
in 15
And that's
minutes.
exactly what I was thinking when you said that.
Yeah,
I'm
so you
like,
can
oh,
do it
just
much
do like,
faster now. Yeah, 11 years ago,
yeah,
I had a spreadsheet and
yeah,
30 tabs open on Google, right? And was just like collating data and like kind of putting it all together, right? But I came to the conclusion that, hey, this is an investment opportunity because if you have a commodity, right, that has supply going down and demand going up, well, that's going to most likely lead to prices going up, right? So kind of simple economics. And I didn't at that time, I had no finance background. I don't have I do have my bachelor's degree, but I never did an MBA or anything. I actually was involved in a tech company mostly before that, and then the wine industry, and then was talking to a very good friend of mine who was in the finance industry, who explained that what I was talking about is I should set up a private equity fund. I knew nothing about private equity. So the next weekend, I went on to investopedia.com, not kidding, and learned all about private equity and learned all about management fees and exit fees and hurdle
yeah,
rates and all the lingo that is, private equity world. And then started to, again, with my friend's help, which was very, very key to the whole thing. Started to get advice from the right lawyers, the right auditors, the right fund management team to put together this thesis, right? And so the next step really was to create what's called a PPM, a private placement memorandum, right? So this ended up being I think about 75-page document that went through every detail of what we planned to do with people's money, right? Because we were going to raise capital and then invest it in bottles of whiskey. Back then, we weren't even doing casks of whiskey. We were just going to buy old and rare bottles of whiskey, hold them for some period of time until they went up in value, and then sell them again at a profit. And then, obviously, with that profit, pay dividends and distributions to
yeah.
investors, right? So, yeah, it was about I think about a 3-4 month process to develop that PPM.
And how big was the fund?
So we raised our goal was to raise 10 million US. It was a very small fund. We ended up oversubscribed and we raised 12 million. But that 12 million took some time. It took about 18 months, close to 2 years to raise that full 12 million. And then we exited, it was a 7-year closed ended fund and we exited at 26 million. So we
Nice.
a little bit more than doubled the size of the fund. So from our perspective, it was successful. We were aiming for 15 to 17% IRR, and we hit 17% IRR at the end of the
Nice.
day. So we were within the range. We had lots and lots and lots of challenges along the way, which has led to lots and lots of learnings as well, which was a great experience. But one of the things I figured out early on was, look, I think I can do the private equity side with the help of some very talented lawyers and management, etc. We could raise the money, but we also then needed to buy the whiskey, right? How are we going to buy $10 million worth of whiskey 11 years ago and buy it well and buy the right whiskeys that are going to go
And
up in
keep it and
price?
store it and
Yeah, and all that stuff, right? So yeah, the storage, yeah, we figured out, and found a storage company in the UK. Obviously, we wanted to centralize everything, get insurance, or have the custodian, all of that. So it was run as a proper fund. So we had our fund
nice.
management company that was the
Is
custodian.
is 2% enough to manage all of that? Like from a, I don't know the
Yeah, good
economics of
question.
like running a
Yeah,
company.
good question. It was back then. It's not now. So the reason, and to explain that further, I think 11, 12 years ago, legal fees and compliance fees are
Yeah,
not what they are today. So if I was going to do a second fund today, 10 million isn't big. 2% of 10 million isn't big enough to cover all the fees and expenses and things that you have today. 12 years ago, it was enough because we kept things simple. We weren't dealing in securities. We were buying physical asset, literally buying bottles of whiskey. So yeah, it worked back then. But I think the compliance world has changed a lot, obviously, in the last 12 years, and the amount of reporting you have to do is very different now. And I think also, when we did it 12 years ago, we did a 7 year fund. I think in today's investor world, nobody's interested in a 7 year fund. 7 years is too long. People, I think, are looking for more 3 to 5 years, right? I think
yeah,
that's kind of the max, really, actually, 3 to 5 years, given obviously, people are making a lot more money in other, new assets, crypto, et cetera, Bitcoin, et cetera, where, you don't have to hold more than potentially a few hours or a few days, right? So it's a different world, I think, in terms of
100%.
those expectations.
Very,
Yeah.
very random stat that has nothing to do with what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Warren Buffett
Yeah.
announced his retirement, and I saw
Right.
some stat that he's gotten investors over 5.2 million percent return,
Right.
versus the S&P has the 39,000% return.
Right.
And I was just like, how does someone even compete with 5.2 million
Millions.
percent?
Yeah.
For every dollar someone put in,
Yeah.
they got out 5.2 million. I mean, I understand this is like 40, 50 years. I don't know how long
Yeah, yeah,
he's
it's
been
a
doing,
long
but
period. Well, I think
anyways,
there was
like,
also, I was reading something similar. That I think he gave, I think it was like 40 years ago, he gave his one of his sons, or his son, like 100,000 US dollars worth of shares, and he told his son,
yeah.
like, that's all you're ever gonna get. That's
He's
it.
like, yeah, great. I'm fine with that.
Well, and his son sold the shares right away and ended up going to like dentistry school or medical school or something like that. Those $100,000 worth of shares would have been worth, 5 million% more
Yeah, yeah.
today, but he made the choice back then, right? So it's all relative, I guess, and it all depends on what
100%,
your
100%,
what your
100%.
passions are, right? But yeah, look, for me, I think the missing piece was finding somebody who, and I think a lot of people who are setting up businesses or potentially looking at funds, right? You have to have the right team, right? And for me, I
100%.
felt like I had a very strong business partner who's still my business partner today, and she was really great. And I think together we were able to raise the money and we were able to structure the fund, but we didn't have that missing piece of how to buy the whiskey. So again, I spent another weekend doing a target list of former master distillers, people who used to run distilleries who don't anymore, but are not fully retired. It's a small list, right? Because people are either still working or they're done working, right? So, excuse me, got that list together. I think it was only about 12, 13 people. Reached out to all of them. Only three replied, but one of them was willing to have a conversation, and he ended up being a very big partner of the
Nice.
fund. Still good friends today. So I think the lesson is sometimes if you don't ask, you don't get, right. So I
100%.
think I think you have to go out there and aim for the team that you want, and just try your luck a little bit. I think if it's meant to be, things kind of align around the right cause and the right timing. So this was somebody I didn't know. who was living in Scotland. And the first, we had several phone calls to kind of talk about our agreement, and then he flew out to Hong Kong in March of 2014. And I remember because we met 8 a.m. in the morning, and then 8:30 we were live on Bloomberg launching our fund 30 minutes later, and had to pretend
Nice.
like we knew each other for years. And it all, obviously now in hindsight, it all worked out. But I think you have to have that reach, and aim for putting together the team you need for any type of project.
100%. Why don't you talk about as you're raising the fund, right? So
Yeah,
you're going from, spending all this time researching.
yeah.
How are you
So
closing these
now fundraising.
checks? How are you deploying them and sort of like how are you just learning on the go, right? Because I think one thing I want to
Yeah,
emphasize for anyone listening is that you don't have to overly plan and be like, I know everything before I go do
yeah.
this.
Just
And
get into
there's
it.
yeah, there's enough of like, okay, do I have the right signal? Is the risk worth it? How do I just make progress to make movement instead of
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm just gonna like wait until I have all the answers before I do this, right?
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think there's that middle ground, right? So we needed the PPM and the subscription documents, right? Because if we pitch somebody and they said yes, we can't be like, hold on, I'll come back to you to finish the subscription, right? So we had that, and then we created a very simple pitch book, right? It was back then it was just a PowerPoint, right, of like 15 slides, and that was what I used for every single meeting, but look, I think if you're starting a fund or raising capital in any way, right, get your basics in order, right? So you need your
Yeah,
subscription agreement. So if somebody says yes, what are you sending them, right? Two, you got to have your story, and that's got to be in 10 slides or less, right? I think Canva and all of these programs are great, but I think with something like this, you do have to write the content. You can make it pretty a thousand ways, but you have to know your story, right? What is your story?
100%.
What are you? What's your angle, or what are you saying is different than what everyone else is saying, right? Because that you have to get. I think the other thing that I did maybe a little bit differently than what I've seen, maybe other people do this, is I always put the ask up front. So I get pitched a lot of ideas, and I hate having to scroll through like 30 slides to figure out the
Yeah, to even see what
valuation.
the idea was.
How much are you trying to raise, and what is the valuation, and what is it for? That should be slide one, in my opinion, right after the
Yeah,
disclaimers, etc. Because I don't want to search through your whole deck just to find that, right? So I put that up front, and I got a lot of positive feedback that people enjoyed. They're
nice.
like, okay, we're right into this. You're asking for it right up front, so that's great without like 30 slides of background info, right? But I think the strategy is relatively simple, and it went through a lot of ups and downs over 2 years. So we raised about our target was 10 million. We raised about 4 million in like 3 months, right? All people we knew, right? So you go to your network first, whether that's your clients or friends or family, whatever it is, you go first. And so we were riding on high. I was like, oh, we'll be done in like 6 months. This will be super easy. Then we went through probably about a 7 8 month lag where we did a ton of roadshow events, and probably spoke to a few hundred different people pitching the idea, and nobody went for it. Nobody passed our initial group of people. Nobody wanted it. So what we did, we went back to the original 4 million, right? And we deployed that 4 million first, and we put it to work. So we put that money to work, right? And so we bought bottles of whiskey. Then when I think it was our 6 month report, and then eventually our 12-month report came out, which was still unrealized gains, but at least we were showing that, hey, in the first 12 months, we were already ahead of schedule, and what we had deployed was up 20+%. That's
Yeah,
when then we were able to use that story to even go back to a bunch of people who had said no the first time and actually change some minds, right? Because we kept
nice.
keep track of everyone. No matter, a no, in my opinion, is not a no forever. It's a no right now. People's
Yeah,
situation
100%.
change, people's finance cash flow change, and I think people respected that. Even a year later, we came back to them and kind of showed them, hey, look, the story's evolved. Why don't you take another look at it, right? And that we're still doing well. And then that, I think, really helped us to then all of a sudden we got a second wave, and then we ended up oversubscribed, right? And so we ended up taking in 12 million instead of 10 million, but that was off of the success of deploying that first round of money, which came from mostly kind of people we knew or people in our network. So I think it's I think you can't kind of be down if you're in a tough part of either
100%.
the
Yeah.
external market or for whatever reasons. I mean, I remember doubting quite a lot. Like, are we ever going to get to 10 million? Does this idea make sense anymore? Da, 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 da. But we kept to the story, and I literally told the pitch to anyone willing to listen. Right, so because even
100%.
if they were going to invest, maybe they knew
They
somebody
may
who was
know
going
someone. Yeah, yeah,
to, right? So you got to be resilient around that. And, I was telling the pitch in my dreams. I could tell you the pitch, probably even today, 14 years later, because it was just ingrained in my head. And that's all I was doing, in and out for that period of time. So it was a very intense period. But yeah, I think the success of being able to deploy a little bit led to more success later.
100%. Just random question that came to my mind was, what happens if you've deployed the four, but you can't get all 10?
Yeah, so we had in there that, like, for example, the four. I don't. So we didn't deploy all four. So we did
Yeah.
drawdown, right? So we took people's money, kind of 50% drawdown, and
Yeah.
then we had a drawdown schedule. So if we didn't hit the 10, then we would have to obviously sell off whatever asset we had at that time. And then I was personally, I put myself on the line. I said I'll cover the initial setup costs, etc., so that if any investor puts in money and we don't get to the 10, we at least get you your money back with whatever we've made at that time. And the
Makes
sunk
sense.
cost of setting up the fund, I was going to take on myself. So I only
Got it.
recouped the fund cost, the setup cost when we hit the 10 plus, right? And then so then the fund was
And
officially
can you
done.
roughly say how much that was?
I mean, I don't know what it's now, right? Because again, let's
Yeah.
be clear, that was 12 years ago, but it was about 50 to 75,000 US dollars.
Okay.
So
Okay.
was the initial to it was mostly legal costs, but a little bit of fund admin costs as well, which again only got reimbursed after the fund was
Makes
fully
sense.
launched
Yeah.
and going. So
Makes sense.
I was also an investor in the fund. I think that's kind of common sense these days, but people want to see your skin in the
Like put
game.
your money where your mouth is, sort of.
Yeah, if you don't believe
Yeah.
in it, why should I believe in it? So I think you have to have some skin in the game yourself, and that I think helps people to be motivated to join you right on your quest rather than just invest in an idea that you have
Makes sense.
or kind of
So
a term.
how do you go from fund exiting the fund to like rare whiskey holding?
Yeah, so it's all about timing. So I think we were pretty lucky and pretty good with the timing of our first fund, 2014. The whiskey market went up, up, up. We had a 5 year out of the 7 year fund. 5 years was active management, so we were buying, selling, trade, active trading, and then 2 years was our wind down and our sell period. So our sell period was 2019 to 2021, which, as you can
Peak COVID.
understand, was Brexit, first Brexit, and then straight into global pandemic, was quite a shock to the system from an external point of view, right? So we managed to exit the fund. It was a 7+1+1, so we could have extended the fund and tried to make slightly more IRR. But for us, for my business partner and myself, we decided, look, this is the world's first fund like this. Most important thing for our track record is we deliver the money back on time. We don't make excuses, and even if it's a slightly lower IRR, let's take it and be happy with what we have. So I think before global pandemic and Brexit, like we were tracking in kind of the mid 20s. Obviously, that we took quite a hit and ended up at 17%, which we're still happy with. But given those factors, it didn't make
Yeah.
sense to go straight into a fund two. So I think
Makes
traditionally, if you
sense.
have a good fund one, you're already raising fund two while fund one is kind of still exiting. But because we were into global pandemic, now 2021, and we didn't know how long really that was going to last at that time, we didn't want to approach a fund two. And the big learning, we had a lot of learnings, but one of the big learnings we had from our first fund was we didn't control the exit strategy, right? So we bought a lot of bottles of whiskey, about 15,000 bottles of whiskey, ended up selling them to distributors in Europe and Asia, and a few high net worth collectors all over the place. but we didn't really control how we were going to sell all that whiskey, right? So we learned a lot from that. And the group that I run now, as I mentioned earlier, we have an auction business, an e-commerce business, we have our own warehouse, logistics, travel business, luxury travel. We also have our own independent bottling brand. Each of these businesses is that exit strategy, right? So I think later this year we'd consider doing a second fund, because actually what we've seen in terms of market timing is in the last 2 years, the prices of whiskey have actually come off quite a bit. So the market has softened a little bit, and we see that this everything goes in cycles. So it's actually a buying opportunity. So we're now talking to a few partners about potentially doing a larger, obviously second fund, using the track record that we have and the experience and the knowledge we have, and now with the exit channels we have and the businesses we've built, setting up that second fund to be hopefully even more
Nice.
successful, right? But it's all about that timing as well. I think right now, given the current macro kind of conditions, it's been a dicey, let's say, first 4 or 5 months of the year. But we're hoping things kind of settle down, and maybe as we look into Q3, Q4, or even early 2026, I'm not saying things are going to be perfect, but we'll know kind of a bit more of the lay of the land. And I think right now, from an investment point of view, I think a lot of people are looking for alternative assets, things that are stable, things
100%.
that things that can make those kind of double digit returns without the high volatility of kind of up and down of what we've seen so far, right, in equity markets. So I think whiskey offers that. I think we've proven it offers that. In the first fund we've done, and now I think we're kind of set up to do it even better, hopefully.
Nice. I love that. I keep making this analogy just because I had the conversation last night, but
Yeah,
I was talking to the OnlyFans marketer, and she was saying that that's one of the industries where, excuse me, that's one of the industries where it doesn't matter what's happening in the market or economic condition, like that's an industry that's alive year long. Yes, there's
yeah,
maybe some differences of like how much discretionary spend is happening,
yeah,
but people are still spending in the adult industry space, irrespective of whether stock markets are up or down. And it's
yeah,
just a really interesting analogy of like, I've been trying to
yeah,
think about how do I change my framework to think
yeah,
about industries this way that are not cyclical, that are not
yeah.
like, there's always going to be some consumption throughout the year from
Yeah,
some
people
group
are.
or the other.
Yeah, people. Yeah, people always ask me how's business, and I always reply, I go, well, people are still getting drunk, as far as I know. So,
Yeah.
people are always drinking. Yes, I think to your
Yeah.
point, people are spending a bit less right now. So maybe they're spending a
But they're
hundred
still
dollars
drinking.
instead of
Yeah.
but people are still drinking. And sometimes when markets are down, people end up drinking more, in fact,
Yeah. Yeah.
to kind of drown their sorrows. But sometimes people market up, people are celebrating. So, yes, I
Yeah.
think, I don't think there's anything as a, there's nothing as a recession proof industry, but I think there are industries that, I guess are less volatile, or at least,
100%.
don't aren't impacted quite as much by what happens in the equity markets. And so far, yeah, we haven't seen any direct correlation between whiskey and really any other asset class, right? It doesn't follow oil, it doesn't follow gold, it doesn't follow Bitcoin. It's on its own trajectory, which is what you want if you're going for real diversification, right? And at the same time, we're seeing across family office and high net worth wealth an increase in collectibles and alternative assets, like taking up a larger percentage of the overall investment portfolio than kind of we've seen in the past, right?
100%. One thing I wanted to get your take on before we wrap up is what's keeping you excited about the space? So you're working on the luxury side of, just whiskey. You have a bunch of businesses in the space. What are you most excited about for the next 2 to 5 years?
Yeah, I'm excited about what we talked about kind of in the beginning, which is this new generation of customer, right? I think that's a whole new challenge, right? I think whiskey was sold very traditionally and was marketed very traditionally, and James Bond movies and things like that. I don't think that appeals to the, let's say, 18 to
Yeah.
25-year old today. I don't think they care about those same things. I don't think they view luxury in the same way. I think people view luxury in a different way. They want personalization and they want customization, and they don't want to be seen necessarily to be seen, which was a very different, way of presenting luxury. So I think that well, look, I love building businesses. Right? I've been an entrepreneur my whole life. Hopefully will continue to be that way if things continue to go well. So I'm always excited by that next challenge, right? So that next challenge is now this new generation of consumers. What is luxury to them? How do we introduce whiskey to a generation that maybe doesn't care about alcohol as much, right? But does care more about health and other things. But at the same time, does it still want to enjoy life? So how do we find that balance? How do we bring technology into this, right? So how are they interacting with brands and having their voice heard in new and interesting ways to help shape brands and shape the
Yeah.
direction brands are going in. So I'm excited by all of that. I think this is just the beginning, really. Whether we're looking at a second fund, or we're looking at a new technology play using blockchain, or we're looking at more of a consumer business, looking at celebrating people's milestones in life. Like, those are just some of the things we're looking at, but there's lots and lots of opportunities, I think, continue to be in this space. So
Nice.
as long as there is opportunity, I'm going to keep challenging ways to hopefully be there and growing businesses that take advantage of that. That's the fun for me, is building those new businesses.
I like that. I love that. And before we wrap up, why don't you plug yourself, what you're working on? Every time I have these conversations with just anyone who's not in tech, I'm just supercharged to be like, okay, is there opportunity for me to do something here? But
Yeah.
um, thoroughly enjoyed thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. But why don't we plug you once again? What are you working on? Who should reach out? Where should they reach out? And we'll link everything for you as well.
Yeah, no, appreciate it. So my company's Rare Whiskey Holdings. So, we specialize in helping people who are interested in learning about whiskey as an alternative asset class, potentially investing in casks of whiskey, from Scotland to traveling and experiencing, luxury experiences in Scotland, all the way to, buying casks for, special milestone celebration, or special bottles for a 40th birthday or a wedding, or anything like that. So yeah, kind of a one-stop shop, hopefully, for all of your whiskey needs. And yeah, thank you for the time. Really appreciated the chat, and hopefully it was interesting for people
100%. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
right
think
now.
I think one of the things I've been super interested about is just expanding horizon, right? So like I don't know if we talked about this when we chatted last, but I was at Indeed.com for 6 years and all I knew was HR tech. Like that's the
Right.
only space and industry I knew. And I started going to a lot of events because I was like, I want to understand more about all these other spaces. I want to understand more about what's going on outside of tech and HR tech because that's what I felt like I really knew. And so
Yeah.
every time I have a conversation that's about some niche industry, like I have a friend who's in payments and he's just telling me about the volume and high risk payments. And then I was talking to this OnlyFans creator who's become a marketer, and she's like, "Yeah, our accounts keep getting blocked because we're
Right.
doing adult high risk content." And so I'm
Right.
just trying to
There's
get
different
as many
challenges.
inputs
Yeah.
as possible. And at some point, I'll be like, "Oh, hey, there's a super niche, lucrative opportunity here." But I just love diving deep into just any
Yeah.
space
Well,
that
let
I'm
me know
very
when.
unaware of, and then yeah,
Yeah, when you get that next $1 billion idea, let us know.
yeah,
Let us
yeah, for
all
sure,
know.
for sure.